Now everybody knows that the C in a YouTube tier list video stands for cringy, contrived, clout-chasing clickbait content. But you saw the video length before you clicked. I gotta have something to entertain myself with as I sit here for 7 hours recording this. Yes, I do re-record a lot of lines because I'm not some sort of weird South African AI voice bot. But the research and writing takes even longer than 7 hours. And after spending a stupid amount of time reading about Jack the Ripper and doing this 5-part series, I realized that just about every person in London who had a mustache was accused one way or another of being the Ripper. Even people with mustaches who weren't even in London at the time of the murders were also accused. So there are hundreds of suspects. And that's probably what makes the Jack the Ripper, Jack the Ripper. See, I do fuck up a lot of lines. And that's probably what makes the Jack the Ripper mystery so enduring. Because it's an impossible puzzle. And for some reason, it kinda reminded me of Death Note. If you've never seen Death Note before, it's a Japanese anime about a kid who finds a notebook that can kill people just by writing their name in it, and how a genius detective named L tries to figure out who the killer is, despite the fact that the notebook can kill from anywhere, is untraceable, and leaves no clues behind. Damn good show. Fucking awful Netflix movie though. Anyway, in my Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel Murder series, I focused on the Joseph Barnett theory. Now, Joseph Barnett was the ex-boyfriend of the final Ripper victim, Mary Jane Kelly. And basically, this guy lost his job around about the same time the second Whitechapel murder victim was found, Martha Tabram. The first Whitechapel murder victim, Emma Smith, was clearly killed by a gang of people, and it's not related to Jack the Ripper. However, Martha Tabram shares a lot of similarities with the other Jack the Ripper victims. So the theory is that when Joseph Barnett lost his job and Mary Jane Kelly had to once again resort to prostitution to make ends meet, this just pissed this guy off and he went out on a fucking rampage. What's interesting is if you look at Martha Tabram, she's the only victim who was stabbed 39 times. This is commonly referred to as overkill, and it clearly shows the killer's state of mind. So the killer was clearly pissed off about something. So the theory is that Joseph Barnett was either trying to scare Mary Jane Kelly off of prostitution by murdering prostitutes, or he just fucking hated them. And based on things that actually came out of his mouth, he admitted that he didn't really like them very much. Other than weird things coming out of his mouth, there is an astonishing amount of coincidences connecting this guy to the murders. However, I did say that coincidences mean nothing, despite how many of them there are. Because back in these days, the police actually needed to catch the killer in the act, they needed a confession, or they needed to find something that directly tied the suspect to a crime scene. And in the case of Joseph Barnett, they actually found something of his that connected him to a crime scene. They found his tobacco pipe in Mary Jane Kelly's room. And they found this just after her murder on the mantelpiece above a fireplace that had one of her skirts burning in it, as well as a bonnet that belonged to a prostitute named Maria Harvey, who we know Joseph Barnett hated. So what does that mean? Not a whole lot, unfortunately, because the police took this tobacco pipe and destroyed it. Now, the argument against this theory that I see all the time is why would Joseph Barnett have killed these other ladies just to scare his girlfriend? Why does a killer do anything? Killers have killed for less. They're fucking weird. But unfortunately, weird is not enough to close the case. You need evidence, and unfortunately, there isn't any. There is nothing that connects anybody to anything. So in the end of my 5-part Jack the Ripper series, my conclusion was, I don't fucking know.
What's wrong? You got nothing else to say?
As a matter of fact, I do. It seems that Twat the Ripper targeted very specific people, all of the same age and quote-unquote occupation. Now think about it. If the Ripper did indeed kill Catherine Eddowes, the casual prostitute who just so happened to match the Ripper's victim profile perfectly, I should tell you that she was dressed as a working class woman, wearing an apron, and she wasn't dressed as a prostitute. Not even her common law husband knew she was a prostitute. So it appears that the Ripper had access to that information that Catherine Eddowes was a prostitute. He got you there. Now, why didn't Jack kill any other working class woman? Why did he only kill prostitutes? Well, that may be the only useful hint in this mystery. And I'll tell you something else that you might find interesting as well. Although this is called the Whitechapel murders, the truth is, all of the murder victims lived within 2 blocks of each other in Spitalfields. This suggests to me that the killer most likely lived somewhere in that area, and specifically chose his targets. Now who, in the blue hell, is one of the very few suspects that actually lived in this area? Joseph Barndog Barnett.
This M guy's pretty good.
Now the police treated the first Whitechapel murder victim as an unrelated incident, but in actuality, the first victim was a prostitute by the name of Martha Tabram. Of all the murder victims during this time, her injuries were by far the most erratic and frenzied. Furthermore, she was last seen with another woman named Mary Ann Connolly. I used that information to deduce this much. The killer most likely lived in Spitalfields, and their first victim was killed because he had reached his breaking point and took out his frustrations on one of the women that ruined his comfortable life, and continued to target the same woman time after time until he killed his very own girlfriend, Mary Jane Kelly. Damn, the Death Note music makes anything sound cool. Well, that at least is the Joseph Barnett theory in a nutshell. There's more to it, of course. Check out the 5-part series to hear it all. But unsurprisingly, again, the conclusion I came to at the end was that it is now impossible to figure this mystery out. Unfortunately, I am not L. I am only M. And no, not that dude who just eats chocolates all the time. My thing is swearing and coffee, so viewer discretion is advised. But with that said though, it's still fun to rip off Death Note and to speculate about who Jack the Ripper might have been. So today, I'm gonna rank a bunch of weirdos that you guys recommended, and a bunch of weirdos that I found online. As is tradition with tier lists, we'll use the Japanese-inspired Capcom style of ranking. At the top, we have S, and S stands for shit son, suspect seriously suspicious. That's good enough for me. A stands for actually an admirable asshole. Wait, no, that's weird on a couple different levels. Attention, asshole alert. B stands for borderline bizarre bumbling brainless buffoon. And C, cunt. I don't know, these are getting hard now. C stands for could be, but probably not. And D just stands for doubt. And that's fine, we don't need any more ranks, this is not so complicated. And I'm gonna put Angry Joe Barnett in the S tier, just so I don't feel like I wasted my time with that 5-part series. If I'm being honest with myself though, he should just be in the A tier because he was an asshole. He did admit to punching Mary Jane Kelly, so fuck him. Yeah, you know what, he's got enough attention already. Let's leave him in the A tier. Well, alright then. I got 20 more suspects and theories to rank, and these are in no particular order. And first up is Montague John Druitt. Now, other than having a name that sounds like some kind of Sherlock Holmes villain, what makes Montague John Druitt suspicious? Well, Druitt is a suspect because Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville McNadden supposedly identified him in his McNadden Memorandum in 1894, noting specifically that the Jack the Ripper murders stopped at the same time John Druitt forfeit the game and drowned himself in the Thames River. And apparently, Druitt's family also privately told Melville McNugget that they thought he was the Ripper. Well, Melville McFlurry, if you think that's suspicious, wait till you hear about all of the coincidences with Joseph Barndog and the 1976 horror movie, The Omen. That will probably blow your fucking balls off. Now, some other reasons people think that this guy was the Ripper is because his father was a surgeon and he was gay. Oh my god. Put him in cuffs already. What a horrific crime. And that's about all people have on this guy. My final verdict for Montague John Druitt is D tier. D for don't waste your fucking time reading about this guy. Next up is Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. Honestly, kinda sounds like a Dark Souls boss. However, he was known to his family and many later biographers as Eddie. Which is a lot less scary. Well, so what's this dude's deal? Well, some doctor and royal family physician suggested that Eddie contracted syphilis in the West Indies, went batshit crazy, and then went on a killing spree in 1888. Then just suddenly stopped, and then died 4 years later in 1892. Some other people think it's cause Eddie fathered an illegitimate royal child with a woman from Whitechapel, and then the royal family ordered a bunch of people to commit some random murders to cover this thing up. And this is only supported by an unpublished official document and a coded letter from a doctor. Wow. What a theory. Well, it would be if it wasn't completely destroyed, because there are actual documents that prove this man was not in London at the time of the murders.
Yeah. It seems you can kill people without having to be there in person.
I will not be praising the son for Eddie. In fact, the suspect is so shit, I'm going to make a brand new tier just for him. F tier. For fuck out of here. You know that some people have asked me to stop shouting and swearing in these videos. You know which tier I would put those people in? Okay, next up is a guy named Francis Tumblety. Now, I did say in the 5-part series that I wouldn't bother reading about this guy, but here I am. Francis Tumblety was an Irish-born American medical quack who earned a small fortune posing as an Indian herb doctor throughout the United States and Canada. He got into trouble with the law a few times and moved around from country to country, eventually ending up in London. Now, apparently, and I am going to use this word a lot because as we know already with the Jack the Ripper mystery, there's a lot of embellishment and misinformation, but apparently, Francis Tumblety was first mentioned as a Ripper suspect by former Detective Chief Inspector John Littlechild of the Metropolitan Police in a letter to journalist and author George R. Sims, dated September 23, 1913. And this letter, by the way, was discovered for sale in an antiquarian bookshop in Richmond upon Thames. So this is obviously a very trustworthy source. Now, this letter was apparently discovered by Stuart Evans and Paul Gainey, the authors of The Lodger, The Arrest and Escape of Jack the Ripper, a book that identifies Jack the Ripper as Francis Tumblety. So yeah, take this section for what you will. Apparently, according to this letter, Detective Littlechild suspected Tumblety because of his extreme misogyny and his previous criminal record. His criminal record included tax evasion, pickpocketing, giving a false testimony, and giving a guy a spoonful of medicine that killed him. Also, a guy named Charles Dunham, who was a spy, a forger, and an American Civil War journalist, claimed that Tumbles appeared to revel in denouncing all women, but reserved a special hatred for prostitutes, because, according to Dunham, he blamed his misogyny on a failed marriage to a prostitute. At an all-male dinner party in Washington, D.C., Tumbles allegedly displayed a collection of uteruses preserved in jars in his study, and proudly boasted that they came from every class of women. Now, Charles Dunham was a C-tier kind of guy, because he was a cunt and a con man who had multiple convictions for forgery, so it's pretty hard to trust him. But if you remember back to episode 2, the Annie Chapman episode, I briefly mentioned an American doctor that asked some students at a university where he could purchase some human organs, so some people think that this might have been Tumbles, although that doctor that asked for the organs was said to have left about 18 months before the murders even started. Tumbles, however, actually was still in the UK during the whole Whitechapel fiasco, and according to Evans and Gainey, he was living somewhere in the Whitechapel District. Sure, I have no reason to doubt that, so I'll believe it. However, I do think it makes more sense that the killer lived somewhere in Spitalfields, but whatever. Now, Tumbles only left the UK and returned to the US on November 20th, 1888, under the false name of Frank Townsend. Now, did he change his name and flee the country because he was the Ripper? Or was it because of the fact that he was arrested for having a homosexual encounter? Which, by the way, was actually a crime at this time, which explains why they were also suspicious of Montague John Druitt. Who knows why? People in those days changed their names all the time. So anyway, Tumbles pays his bail of £300, which would be 42 fucking thousand pounds today. For my South African viewers, that's almost 1 million rand. This guy could have bought himself 3 Suzuki Jimneys, or a nice apartment somewhere by the beach. South Africa is fucking cheap. But it wasn't cheap in those days to be caught having a homosexual encounter. So while awaiting his trial, and knowing that Scotland Yard thought he might be the Ripper, because, I mean, if he's gay, just imagine what he's capable of, Tumbles then fled the country. What a shit time to be alive. When it comes to Tumbles though, the only coincidental or circumstantial evidence about him is that he's a medical quack and he left the country when the murders stopped. Firstly, we know that Jack the Ripper most likely had less atomical knowledge of human body parts than the prostitutes he was killing. Secondly, Tumbles fled the country almost 2 weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, giving him enough time to leave Scotland Yard with an encore, so to speak. Fair enough though, he probably knew that Scotland Yard was watching him, which they were, But Jack the Ripper didn't really need a lot of time to do what he did to those ladies. But he went back to America on November 20th, 1888, and Scotland Yard actually sent someone to trail Tumbles to see if he did anything suspicious. That way then they could extradite him and bring him back to the UK and beat his ass and name him Jack the Ripper. But the copper that followed him said, quote, "There is no proof of his complicity in the Whitechapel murders, and the crime for which he is under bond in London is not extraditable." Well, I found this Reddit post by a user that deleted himself, hopefully not in the Thames River because people will start accusing him of being Jack the Ripper too, but he gives a whole list of reasons why he thinks Tumbles was Jack the Ripper. At the bottom it says, "Share your thoughts," so I did. I said, "K, he sounds like a cunt," but I doubt it. Suspect number 4 is a guy named Walter Sickert, and to put it simply, the reason he's a suspect is because he had a morbid fascination with murder. Well, if that's all it takes to be a potential serial killer, we're all going to jail. Now, Walter Sickert was a German-born British artist and printmaker, and during the 1880s, he mostly lived in France, which is a problem since he wasn't in London.
Here, it seems you can kill people without having to be there in person.
Now, Walter Sickert was a pretty standard dude. He didn't really do a lot of weird things. He got married, he got divorced, got married again, had a mistress on the side, and then got another wife after that. But according to the author Patricia Cornwell, this is the guy. This is Jack the Ripper. And she was so confident about that she wrote a book. It's called Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed. She says that she believes 100% that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. Now my question is there at least one good reason this time? I don't think so, but maybe you will. According to Patricia Cornwallis, Sickert is believed to have had a number of operations as a child that were incredibly painful and led to him becoming impotent. The psychological effects of this, Cornwell believes, left him with a pathological hatred of women, and is believed to have been the case with a number of serial killers like Jack the Ripper. Well, like I said just a minute ago, he had several wives, he had a mistress, and he had an illegitimate son. So it sounds like you're wrong. Back to Cornwallis, quote, "In addition, his fascination with murder, and the Ripper killings in particular, led him to paint a series of work including Jack the Ripper's bedroom and paintings that were inspired by a murder of a Camden Town prostitute called Emily Dimmock, a crime which was obviously very similar to those in the Ripper killings." Well, Patricia Cornwell wrote a book on Jack the Ripper, so by her very own definition and logic, she is Jack the Ripper too. If by just being fascinated with the case makes you a suspect, then you are a suspect too. This is fucking stupid. To make this theory even worse, Cornwell believes that Sickert is the guy who wrote the Jack the Ripper letters. Well, that's also wrong because we know who wrote the Jack the Ripper letters. It was the journalist from the Star named Fred Best, and he did that to keep the newspaper in business. Now, even if Fred Best was lying and he didn't write the letters, it's generally agreed that these letters were hoaxes and they were not written by the killer. The only exception maybe being the From Hell letter. I personally, though, think the From Hell letter was a hoax, and I base that on the fact that Major Henry Smith spoke a lot of shit. So if he's out there saying, oh yeah, this kidney had Bright's disease, I'm saying he's probably lying. However, there is still a small chance that it could have been real and it could have been from Catherine Eddowes. If it was real, it's been said though that that letter was written in an Irish dialect. Walter Sickert was German. But anyway, Patricia Cornwell spent some money on doing some DNA matches on envelopes and stamps that Walter Sickert licked, and it was said that there was a possible match. The problem is that is only a possible match to his mitochondrial DNA. And do we really need to go over this again? Mitochondrial DNA doesn't work that way. One final fucking irrelevant point here is it's been said that the type of paper the hoaxed letters were written on was similar to paper that Sickert wrote letters on. The problem here is that that paper was extremely common. With all that said, my final verdict for Walter Sickert is an S tier. As an artist though, his paintings are amazing, but I'll put him in C tier because you should always be wary of an artist, you know. Never really know what they're thinking. Next up is Carl, we can all live together. Yeah, next up is Carl Feigenbaum, an actual convicted murderer who apparently, there's that word again, who apparently confessed to being Jack the Ripper before he was executed for another murder. Unfortunately, the only person who heard this confession was his lawyer. But even still, why haven't we heard this guy's name more then? Well, no one's really sure if he actually did say that, and if he did say that, if he was just saying it to buy himself some more time before he was executed. Or if, he was just trying to be a good guy to clear his conscience or something. Seems like most people think he was lying or that the lawyer was lying. Well, anyway, who was this dickhead anyway? Carroll Feigenbaum, otherwise known by his alias Anton Zahn, was a German merchant sailor, occasional florist, and a piece of shit that was executed at the Sing Sing prison in New York in 1896. His crime was murdering his landlord, Mrs. Juliana Hoffman. Juliana was a 56-year-old widow who lived in a two-room apartment above a shop at 544 East 6th Street in New York, and she lived there with her 16-year-old son Michael. Like many poor families at the time, she decided to earn extra money by renting out the other room in their apartment. Unfortunately, the first tenant they had was Carl Feigenbaum. Carl told the Hoffmans that he had lost his job as a gardener and therefore had no money. However, he assured them that they could all live together and had been promised a job as a florist, and that once he was paid, he would be able to pay them the rent that he owed them. Juliana said okay. Then, shortly after midnight, in the early hours of September 1st, 1894, Michael was awoken by a scream and looked across to his mother's bed and saw Carl Feigenbaum leaning over Juliana with a knife. It seemed that Carl had decided that they could not, in fact, all live together. Michael then lunged at Feigenbaum, who then turned around and came at him with the knife. Realizing then that he would be no match against Feigenbaum, Michael then jumped out of the window and started screaming for help in the streets, all the while looking through the window, watching Feigenbaum stabbing his mother in the neck. He then slit her throat and severed her jugular. Feigenbaum then returned to his room, escaped out the window, climbed down into the yard, washed his hands at the pump, and then made his way out into an alleyway that led to the streets. Meanwhile, a cop and a bunch of other people nearby heard Michael screaming, and as Feigenbaum emerged from the alley, he was spotted by the crowd. He then tried to make a run for it, but they quickly caught this motherfucker, beat his ass, and then dragged him back to Michael's apartment. Michael then identified him as the piece of shit who killed his mother. The police then arrested him and took him to the station. While the police were questioning him and asked him, "What the fuck did you do that for?" this dickhead then said it wasn't him. It was some other guy named Jacob Weibel. And this punk-ass bitch would stick to that story until his death. It turned out though that he was trying to steal money from Juliana that she kept in a tin somewhere, and she caught him in the act. The cops also learned around this time that Carl Feigenbaum is not his real name. It's just another alias, and his real name was actually Anton Lahn. The police then said, "Anton, we hope you like Metallica, because you are gonna ride the lightning." For non-Metallica fans, that means get the electric chair. Hey, if you haven't, you should really listen to Metallica's second album. It's a fucking masterpiece. Pretty soon after that, the state of New York had an extra crispy Feigenbaum. And then suddenly, articles about his confession began appearing in British newspapers. One of which was the following report, which appeared in the Reynolds newspaper on Sunday, May 3rd, 1896. Quote, "An impression, based on an 11th hour confession and other evidence, prevails that Carl Feigenbaum, who was executed at Sing Sing on Monday, the real murderer of the New York outcast nicknamed Shakespeare, is possibly Jack the Ripper of Whitechapel notoriety. The proofs, however, are far from positive." End quote. Not even this newspaper from 1896 was prepared to go full clickbait and say, "OMG, Carl Feigenbaum was Twat the Ripper." Then a week later, on Sunday, May 10th, 1896, Lloyd's Weekly newspaper published a more detailed account of the confession, which, like I said, was made to Carl's lawyer, William Stanford Lawton. Lawton, what a perfect name for a lawyer. Carl Feigenbaum, who was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing last week, is reported to have left a remarkable confession with his lawyer. The account of the lawyer reads, quote, "I have a statement to make, which may throw some light on the murder for which the man represented was executed. Now that Feigenbaum is dead and nothing more can be done for him in this world, I want to say as his counsel that I am absolutely sure of his guilt in this case, and I feel morally certain that he is the man who committed many, if not all, of the Whitechapel murders." Isn't it funny how often we hear this? "I am 100% sure this idiot is Jack the Ripper." But the evidence is about as convincing as the ghost clips in a Nuke's Top 5 video. Back to the confession, quote, "Here are my reasons, and on this statement I pledge my honor. When dipshit was in the tombs awaiting trial, I saw him several times. The evidence in his case seems so clear that I cast about for a theory of insanity. Certain actions denoted a decided mental weakness somewhere. When I asked him point blank, "Did you kill Mrs. Hoffman?" he made his reply, "I have for years suffered from a singular disease, which induces an all-absorbing passion. The passion manifests itself in a desire to kill and mutilate the women who falls in my way. At such times, I am unable to control myself." On my next visit to the tombs, I asked him whether he had not been in London at various times during the whole period covered by the Whitechapel murders. He answered, "Yes, I was." "Oh my God, call Scotland Yard." I asked him whether he could not explain some of these cases, on the theory which he had suggested to me, and he simply looked at me in reply. The statement, which is a long one, proves conclusively that Feigenbaum was more or less insane, but the evidence of his identity with the notorious Whitechapel criminal is not satisfactory. End quote. Now, as my favorite website, jacktheripper.org says, the suggestion that Carl Feigenbaum was the Ripper depends entirely on if William Lawton's account of the confession is true. But at the same time, there is no evidence to suggest that William Lawton made all of this up. But there is also no evidence to suggest that Feigenbaum was the Ripper. He could have just been sitting down there in the tomb awaiting his execution, hearing now for whom the bell tolls. He may have felt a little trapped under ice, and in confessing to the Whitechapel murders, he may have felt that he could have escaped riding the lightning to his creeping death. Moses! He definitely ripped in that solo. Yeah, ripped Lars Ulrich's eardrums. Thank the gods of rock that he fixed that Unforgiven solo. Now, before you ask why Kirk the Ripper Hammett is in this Jack the Ripper video, well, in what other video am I going to be able to make fun of that fucking disaster right there? No, in all serious, Kirk Hammett is the reason I've been playing guitar for 20 years. It's probably also the reason I'm not good at it. Oh my god, I'm sorry, I'm so fucking stupid. Alright, let's get serious again. This is all some pretty weak sauce so far, and to make it even worse, Feigenbaum's other attorney, U.O. Pentecost, just straight up said he didn't believe Feigenbaum was Jack the Ripper. The New York Times then published his objections on April 29, 1896. I shall summarize, quote, "The suggestion that Carl Feigenbaum may have been Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel murderer, was accepted by few as worthy of investigation. Lawyer Lawton maintained nothing in his suggestion, and based it on his opinion that Feigenbaum had homicidal mania. Due to his secretive and crafty nature, an unsatisfactory admission by Feigenbaum that he was in London when the crimes of the Ripper were committed, and an offhand declaration by a physician that blood on the knife used to kill Mrs. Hoffman might have been on it for a year. This theory is confronted with a declaration made by Dr. L. Forbes Winslow, that the Whitechapel murders were committed by a medical student of good family whose mind was wrecked by study. His insanity took the form of religious fervor and homicidal impulse. He was found and incarcerated in a penal asylum. No anatomical murder occurred after his arrest. I do not like to spoil a good story, but I take no stock in my colleague's story myself, while as to the facts, Mr. Lawton of course is able to tell more than I, as I only knew our client to talk through an interpreter. In Feigenbaum, I found nothing in his homicidal method to remind me of the Ripper. Yes, one fact perhaps, the absence of blood on him after the killing. If it were proved that Feigenbaum was Jack the Ripper, it would not greatly surprise me, because I always considered him a cunning fellow, surrounded by a great deal of mystery, and his life history was never found out." End quote. Well, he definitely gets an A for asshole, but whether or not he's Jack the Ripper, I doubt it. Next up is Thomas Hayne Cutbush. Now, if I may offer you a ride in my DeLorean and take you back to the past to about, 40 seconds ago, I quoted U.O. Pentecost saying this: Dr. L. Forbes Winslow theorized that the Whitechapel murders were committed by a medical student of good family whose mind was wrecked by study. Well, either there's someone else out there who was exactly like this guy, or he was talking about Thomas Hayne Cutbush. But to be honest, I actually think he was talking about somebody else. I just thought that was a good segue. Now, Thomas Cutbush was first officially named a Jack the Ripper suspect by the Sun newspaper in February 1894. Now, we could move on right now because we know how trustworthy these newspapers really were at the time. However, we'll pad the runtime of this video by at least eliminating some more suspects. And that's because investigators at the time had already looked into this guy and ruled him out of the case. Now, according to JackTheRipperTour.com, Thomas Cutbush was raised by his mother and aunt in Kennington and was considered to be middle class. However, in his early 20s, he began to exhibit worrying behavior, including aggression and violence. Indeed, it was reported that he had pushed his employer down the stairs while working as a canvasser for the directory, Moses. After this, he shied away from employment and instead turned his attention to studying medicine. Hopefully so that he could fix the guy that he pushed down the stairs. By 1888, and the start of the infamous Jack the Ripper killings, Cutbush had started having delusions, which are believed to have been caused by contracting syphilis. As with others connected to this case, this could have easily been caught through being intimate with a prostitute. Cutbush claimed that he was being poisoned, and his behavior became ever more erratic, wandering the streets at night, and regularly returning covered in stains, whether mud or blood. Over the next few years, there were a number of reports made about young women being attacked and stabbed in the back or buttocks by a man with a knife. Cutbush was soon committed to St. Saviour's Infirmary after reports were made of him threatening his mother and aunt with a knife. He managed to escape and was on the run for over 3 days. During this time, he stole clothing, visited his family home, and was reported being seen in Camden, excitedly rambling about being Jack the Ripper. During this period, 2 further women, Isabel Anderson and Grace Florence Johnson, were attacked and stabbed in the buttocks. His aunt found a knife on him, reported to have blood on it, and then she presented this to the police. On March 9, 1891, Cutbush was arrested after being found breaking into his home and had some suspicious drawings in his coat, depicting women mutilated and cut open. His trial started on March 23rd and concluded on April 14th, where Cutbush was declared insane and moved to the high-security Broadmoor Hospital. Soon, he became more violent, and his delusions became worse as time went on. He refused to wash or take visitors. In fact, it is believed that the last time his mother visited, he bit her as she tried to kiss him. He later died of kidney disease in 1903. End quote. Well then, to quote one of my least favorite YouTubers, did you see it? Cutbush was only declared insane and committed to Broadmoor in 1891, about 2 or 3 years after the Ripper had already stopped. Obviously, this is a problem in the Ripper timeline, because most people kinda agree that there needs to be at least some kinda reason that Jack the Ripper just stopped. Mostly because he seemed like the kinda that wouldn't just stop. So again, that's a big problem. That said though, in 2008, Broadmoor released Cutbush's medical records. According to these records, this guy was a few sandwiches short of a picnic. Cutbush was born in 1864, and he led a perfectly ordinary life until 1888, when he started to go cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. At the time, doctors linked this to heredity and overstudy. He spent hours and hours studying his medical textbooks, and he wasn't the only family member to be called insane either. His uncle, who also happened to be a Metropolitan Police Superintendent, forfeit the game by popping a cap in himself in front of his own daughter. Moses! It just gets worse. Cutbush was said to disappear frequently, only to come home covered in mud and sometimes blood. Now, him being covered in blood is also a problem, obviously, because the doctors said that the Ripper probably would have no blood on him. And why the fuck the Ripper would be rolling in mud is another mystery. But his aunt claimed he was occasionally violent, which he demonstrated in 1903 by attempting to bite his mother when she visited him in Broadmoor. This guy also apparently threatened attendants with knives and struggled with paranoid delusions. At one point, he believed his food was poisoned, and that the doctors and his legal counsel were conspiring to kill him. And that is about all there is to the Thomas Cutbush theory. That's about all the evidence you need to be called Jack the Ripper. And people have even claimed, without evidence, that the police orchestrated a cover-up because the Whitechapel murders were really committed by Thomas, the nephew of one of their own. Now, of course, this was a theory by Dr. L. Forbes Winslow, and funnily enough, he too would become a Jack the Ripper suspect. This is basically because he was an expert on mental illness and his theories on the case were controversial. And by controversial, I mean because he changed who he thought the Ripper was a few times, so people thought, that's pretty suspicious, man. You are probably Jack the Ripper. People also put him in the C tier because they called him a charlatan. You thought I was gonna say c***. Well, I'll go with the people's opinion and we'll keep Dr. Forbes Winslow in the C tier and we'll put, what's his name again? I already forgot that fucking guy's name. Thomas Cutbush in the B tier. Anyway, moving on to the next guy, Thomas Neill Cream, also known as the Lambeth Poisoner. Now this guy is an S tier piece of shit and an interesting story all on his own, but he is definitely not Jack the Ripper. However, just to tell you quickly why he's a suspect, it's because Cream murdered up to 10 people in 3 different countries, targeting mostly lower class women, prostitutes, and pregnant women seeking abortions. Holy Mother of God, that escalated quickly. Now, after his reign of terror and he was finally caught for being a stupid c***, he was sentenced to hang, and his hangman, a guy named James Billington, claimed that Cream's last words were, quote, "Oi, are we lads? I am Jack the..." Excuse me. The police were there to witness the spectacle. However, they all said they remember none of that. Furthermore, Cream was in prison during the duration of the Whitechapel murders. And also, this prison was not in London. So while Cream gets the T tier for being a total piece of trash, in the Jack the Ripper tier list, he gets the F tier. Next up is James Maybrick. Now what's absolutely hilarious about James Maybrick is the fact that some people think that this guy is a suspect because the real Jack the Ripper forged the Maybrick Diary to frame James Maybrick as Jack the Ripper, making the Maybrick Diary a hoax by Jack the Ripper. And that sounds like something that you'd hear on the History Channel at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, James Maybrick was never even considered a person of interest until 1992, when a dude named Michael Barrett came out and said, "Oi, bruv, I've got this diary from a bloke named James Maybrick. He's saying he's the Whipper." So people came out and wasted their time examining this diary, and then immediately put it into the T tier. Then Michael came out again and said, "You know what, bruv, I forged this diary." Then everyone said, "Well, hey, thanks for at least being honest." But then Michael came out again and said that he didn't actually forge it and that this book was in his ex-wife's family since the Second World War, but it was already too late. We no longer trust you. Next thing we know, you're saying Jack the Ripper himself gave you this diary. But you know, I did actually give the Maybrick Diary a few extra seconds of my time and went to look if there was anything convincing written in it. The answer is no. James Maybrick and the Maybrick Diary get the T tier. Yeah, I know, I'm just making up tiers as we go along. Gotta keep everyone on their toes. Next up is... oh no. Severin Antonowicz Klasowski, better known as, thank God, George Chapman, who was a Polish serial killer known as the Barrow Poisoner. Now I'm sure you remember Inspector Frederick Aberline of Scotland Yard. His name came up repeatedly in my 5-part Jack the Ripper series because he was one of the original investigators in the Jack the Ripper case. And reportedly, he told George Godley, the copper who arrested George Chapman, quote, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." Wow, well that's pretty good. Let's see where this goes. In 2 interviews with the Pall Mall Gazette in 1903, Inspector Aberline spoke about the Ripper case and referred to George Chapman by name, saying that he thought Chapman was the Ripper because during the original investigation, he had closely interviewed Chapman's first wife, Lucy, and she said that her husband often used to go out during the night for hours on end. And that's pretty much it. So hold on here a second. So if you had a mustache, were fascinated by the Jack the Ripper case, or just went outside at night, you were now a Jack the Ripper suspect. What's next? If you wrote children's tales, you're a Jack the Ripper suspect. Now it's important to mention a few things here. As far as is known, George Chapman was not a suspect at the time of the murders, but he would soon become a serial killer himself much later. And the murders that he did end up committing were done with poison, not ripping. He killed 3 of his mistresses between 1897 and 1902 by giving them a chemical called tartaremetic. So then why do people like Inspector Aberline suspect him? Basically, it's just a bunch of coincidences again that make him look suspicious. Like for one, he was a violent misogynist. He was known to beat his common law wives and displayed other violent behaviors. Violent behaviors like when he was living in the US. Apparently, George Chapman forced his wife Lucy down on their bed and began to strangle her, and only stopped because a customer walked into their shop. which was connected to their bedroom. According to Lucy, when he left, she found a knife under the pillow, and when he came back to her, he told her that he planned on beheading her, and even pointed out the spot where he would have buried her body, and recited what he would have said to their neighbors. So I have no doubt that this guy was a piece of shit, but what made him change his mind about killing Lucy? Now listen, I'm not saying he should have just gone back in there and killed her, I'm just asking what made him change his mind. Was he just trying to scare her, telling her all that shit, or was he genuinely serious? I don't know, I suppose it's irrelevant. Couple more reasons that he was suspected to be Twat the Ripper is that he arrived in Whitechapel roughly around the time the first murder took place. But which murder? Emma Smith, Martha Tabram, or Mary Ann Nichols? Unclear. Another reason is that his description matched the man that was last seen with Mary Jane Kelly, but so did a lot of people. And then the murder stopped when he left for the United States. And damn, I got no rebuttal for that one. You heard it on the Mystorian first, ladies and gentlemen. George Chapman was Jack the Ripper. Case closed. Now, if you need more proof, and I don't know why you would, because this theory is so solid, George Chapman has even been accused of carrying out a Ripper-style killing once he got back to New York City, which would be the murder of Carrie Brown. However, George Chapman was not in New York City at the time of her murder.
Yeah. It seems you can kill people without having to be there in person.
Will I ever stop using that joke? Well, when it stops feeling appropriate, I guess. Now, I just gotta clear up, I was just joking about George Chapman being Jack the Ripper in case it wasn't clear. But moving along, a guy named Robert Mulnew, who was a recently retired Metropolitan Police Directorate of Forensic Services, presented a paper to the International Association for Identification Conference in 2011 and to the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences in 2014. What the fuck am I saying? I don't know. But he suggested in this paper who he believed the most likely Ripper suspect was. And based on his expertise, that suspect was George Chapman. Now, he came to this conclusion by reviewing a case of a 1901 or 1902 murder victim named Mary Ann Austin. She was also a prostitute who was also attacked, but there's two pretty big differences here. She was attacked 14 years after the Whitechapel murder sprees ended. And not only that, she actually survived long enough to describe her killer. She said he was a Russian man about 5'7" tall with a black mustache. And this guy came and asked for her services, and in the course of getting busy with her, he stabbed her and tried to cut out her uterus. Now, assuming this is true and there's actual evidence of this, I'm not going to bother to check because it really doesn't matter. This is clearly quite different to how Jack the Ripper operated. Firstly, it's 14 years later, and secondly, Jack the Ripper seemingly did nothing with his victims other than kill them and rip them. So other than that preposterous hypothesis, the main argument against George Chapman is that it would be unusual for a serial killer to change his modus operandi, especially from mutilation to poisoning, although some people say that that would not be unusual at all. Fair enough, doesn't change the fact that the biggest problem with this guy as a suspect is that he could not speak English at the time, and Twat the Ripper would have almost certainly had to, according to eyewitness reports about the suspect holding conversations with some of his victims, like for example, Annie Chapman.
No relation.
Another question is, as a recent immigrant, would George Chapman have known the area so well as Jack the Ripper seemingly did? Because it seems that he was able to avoid the police while they were out on their beats and make his escape. And one final problem with George Chapman is it seems that Jack the Ripper selected victims who were previously unknown to him. However, I've shown on a map why I personally don't really agree with that, unless he just got incredibly lucky, and this just happened by pure chance. But George Chapman is known to have only killed acquaintances. Therefore, in my dumbass opinion, that point is actually in favor of Chapman. However, I also personally think that the killer may have lived around here in Spitalfields. Chapman seems to have worked somewhere in Whitechapel during the murders, but I can't find his exact home address. I found some shit about him working at a barbershop under the White Hart pub, which would be very close to where Martha Tabram was killed, but he was only working there in 1890. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I don't think that this was the guy, and I'm going to move on. George Chapman gets the A tier because he was an asshole, but I don't think he was Jack the Ripper. Next up is Charles Allen Lechmere. Now, a lot of you guys said that you're pretty sure that Lechmere is Jack the Ripper. And hey, maybe. I do need to admit that I'm not 100% convinced, but I also cannot deny that he did something inexplicably fucking weird. In episode 2, the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, I just realized that earlier I said episode 2 was the murder of Annie Chapman. No, that's episode 3. In episode 2, I covered Lechmere a little more thoroughly. So for this next bit in the video, you do kinda need to be familiar with what Lechmere did and said, but very basically, according to Charles, he's walking along Bucks Road about 3:40 a.m. on his way to work, and he comes across some dark mass in the road. He stops to look at it, and then he realizes, oh no, it's a dead woman. The woman of course turned out to be Mary Ann Nichols, and then he just stays there for 5 minutes. Then 5 minutes later, a guy named Robert Paul is walking down Bucks Road about 3:45 a.m. and then he stumbles upon Lechmere just staring at this body. Lechmere then says, come and look at this woman. Now, him being there for 5 minutes would theoretically give him more than enough time to mutilate Mary Ann Nichols. However, it needs to be considered that this heavily relies on both of these guys recalling exactly what time it was to the exact minute. Because almost always when people ask me the time, even if I check it, I'll round it up or down because I'm just a dickhead. But this is a different situation entirely. This is a murder. Now, are we sure that they're sure? Isn't it a bit peculiar that both of the men are on this round time of 3:40 and 3:45? I don't know, but let's assume that they are correct. What was Lechmere doing for 5 minutes? Just staring at this body. And then all of a sudden he was in a hurry again and had to run off to work. So I agree, that's very weird. I then asked 5 questions, and I got a really good and well thought out answer, which does shed some more light on this Charles Lechmere guy. So thank you Mordant Magic, I hope I got that right, for your response and allowing me to read it in this video. Now before I start reading, let me just reiterate that it is impossible now to figure out who Jack the Ripper really was. And this suspect right here, Charles Lechmere, is a perfect example why. There is a clear disparity in information and accounts, and wherever you look, you'll get different facts. So I'm not going to say that I'm right, and I'm not going to say that any of the sources I used are right. The problem is, someone is clearly wrong. And that's just the whole Jack the Ripper story. Anyway, let's cover Lechmere. Question 1 I asked is, why is a man who is not afraid to literally eviscerate a human being in public too afraid to run away when he hears footsteps approaching him from 40 yards or 36 meters away? Quote, Jack the Ripper would have very likely been a psychopath and would be less likely to have the types or levels of anxieties we might expect of a normal person. I don't know anyone that argues that he froze in fear. He simply wasn't apparently moving when he first came into sight of Robert Paul. This was either him thinking over options or just standing there a second as he ascertained who it was approaching. However, fight, flight, and freeze are responses we could possibly expect from Jack the Ripper, psychopath or not. If it was Lechmere, he chose fight, which means in this case deciding to attempt to gain control of the witness and situation, and I actually think that this was the more reasonable choice than running off. Lechmere couldn't know what Paul would do if he started running. Whether Leech was Jack or not, he may well have had an idea of the police beats and even their rough timing and placement, especially if he was Jack the Ripper. This would be of supreme interest to him. There were 2 officers not extremely far away, one of whom was blocking probably the best possible escape route. Many think he should have just run right away, but that would be by far the most likely thing to cause a cry from Paul and draw any policemen nearby. Both of his escape routes away from Paul had police not far off them, so had Leech been Jack the Ripper and done that, an officer could have seen a running out-of-breath man and a likely disturbed Paul yelling murder, or at least about an attacked woman close after him. So what about walking on normally? Lechmere couldn't know that Paul would not see the body if he went along his way. Imagine Lechmere continuing to walk on his way after standing in the middle of the street, and then Paul looking across the street sees a woman on the ground. It's notable Paul described the woman as plain enough to see, and criticized cops for, in his opinion, having walked by and not having noticed it. So it was not pitch black. If Leech walked on at a normal pace, he'd have no way to know at all that Paul wouldn't cry murder, or at minimum dash to get a police officer and describe him. He'd suddenly have a lot more to explain. By approaching Paul, he was able to control the situation. He planted into Paul's mind that he was a bystander like Paul, thus having Paul become a witness in his favor. He was also able to dissuade him from moving the body and uncovering the fresh carnage. He even tried to steer him from thinking the woman was still alive slightly, as Paul felt a faint heartbeat, but Leach told him at the time and reiterated later that in his opinion, the woman was dead and cold. Though according to Constable Misen, he left that out when he told him about it. Lechmere then walked with Paul all the way to his work, even though it wasn't the fastest route for himself. Alright, now I'm going to pause here for a second. Now I have read your entire comment and I agree with pretty much everything that you're saying. Now when I read up about this guy, the theory that I saw repeated a lot is that because all the victims were killed between his house and his work, he was killing them on his way to work. The victims though are scattered quite widely, so that would mean that he had to have changed his route regularly. He didn't always take the same route to work. So do we know which route he took to work, or are we just going with the Google Maps fastest route? Not that it really matters, he had to have taken different routes to kill these people in different places. But also, a lot of these people were killed on the days before a bank holiday. So was he off work? Was he going to work? I don't know what he was doing. But again, I can't explain this guy standing there staring at a body for 5 minutes. Moving on. Now, this allowed Charles to likely discuss what happened more and get a read on Paul's thoughts and even help direct Paul's thoughts further if need be. It's a very classic move of controlling a person to want to grab a hold of a narrative and steer it. Being almost certainly a psychopath were he the killer, Lechmere wouldn't have the same type of anxiety or fear of his ability to do so as we might. I might add as well that Paul thought at first that Lechmere was going to attack him. While this could be written off as his fear of the dark street itself, it's also possible Leach's body language or demeanor contributed to this idea. It's not out of possibility that Leach was still deciding what to do and contemplating attacking Paul either in that moment or if he found out he couldn't get a handle on the narrative. And hey again, I do agree with pretty much everything that you're saying here, so I did pin your comment on that video so everybody could read the full thing, but I am going to jump ahead a little bit. Now Charles Lechmere is known to have pulled down Mary Ann Nicholls' dress, possibly to hide her abdominal wounds. In every other Jack the Ripper case, the dress was left up. Charles also presumably covered her neck in some way, unless her chin was down and it was already hidden, so that Paul couldn't see her wounds. Because I was pretty sure that 2 slashes to the throat would be very visible up close, but apparently Robert Paul didn't see that. So I guess it makes sense that Charles Lechmere was hiding that. Another thing to point out is that Robert Paul didn't notice a lot of blood, but that was just a normal thing with Jack the Ripper murders because Jack would strangle the ladies before he killed them, and that would make them bleed less. So pretty good stuff so far. Question 2 was, if Charles was the killer, why would he tell a police constable about the dead body of a woman in Bucks Row? And here's where the disparity in information starts. So Mordant Magic says that while he was with Paul, it would certainly seem odd if he ignored a policeman and just walked off just as he and Paul had decided that they were going to tell someone. And I agree. But the problem is, which story do we go with? One story says that they parted ways, and the other one says that they walked down Bucks Row together. So this is apparently what Robert Paul said, according to the Evening Standard. Yes, the newspaper from the time, that's probably not a very trustworthy source, but this was published in the September 3rd, 1888 edition. Quote, I was obliged to be punctual at my work, so I went on and told the other man I would send the first policeman I saw. I saw one in Church Row, just at the top of Bucks Row, who was going round calling people up, and I told him what I had seen and asked him to come, but he did not say whether he should come or not. So yeah, which story is the one that happened? What we do know is that Constable Misen was told that he was wanted in Bucks Row because there was a woman there, and anything else after that it's anybody's guess. Back to Mordant Magic's comment. Paul's paper interview was seemingly very different than both his inquest statement and Charles Lechmere's statement. He overblew his own involvement and may well have altered other things. We know based on his inquest statement, Lechmere's statement, and Misen's that he actually didn't talk to Misen at all, contrary to what he said in the paper. Another difference is that in both Lechmere's statement and Paul's later inquest one, he seemed to think she could be alive, believing he felt her breathing, and he wanted to prop her up, which Lechmere discouraged. Alright, pretty good information so far. Question 3 was, why would Charles Lechmere attend the inquest on day 2 and give them his actual home address and place of employment? Mordant Magic says he didn't. I assume that you're talking about his real name. Yes, that's true. They never figured out that he was actually Charles Allen Lechmere, but he did give them his actual home address and place of employment at the inquest. As for giving them the name Cross, it's believed that because his stepfather's name was Cross and he was a police officer, maybe he gave them Cross to get some sort of favor. I don't know. But yeah, they never figured out that he was actually Charles Allen Lechmere. But why did he attend the inquest and give his real address? Lechmere came forward 3 days after the incident, and only after Paul's statement to the paper had been published. Now this is also something that's kind of tricky. Now I have looked and looked and looked and I cannot find it, but if there is a mention of what time Mary Ann Nichols' inquest happened, then I would agree 100%. But I cannot find it, so there's no mention if it happened in the morning, the afternoon, or the evening. And the Evening Standard, where Robert Paul's statement was printed, was a newspaper that was only sold in the late afternoon and evening to capture readers on their way home from work. So if we know what time Mary Ann Nichols' inquest happened, then you have a very, very fucking good point. I just sadly cannot find the time that it started. So if anybody does, please let me know. Now again, I just want to say one more time that I agree with pretty much everything that you've said here. And I want to thank you again for letting me read it. And I know I didn't read the whole thing, but I did pin your comment on that video so that everybody can go and check it out for themselves. If you haven't read it, it's on episode 2, it's on the Mary Ann Nichols episode, and it's the pinned comment. You can read the whole thing. Now reading this comment and a little bit more about Charles Lechmere has kind of made me change my mind about this guy a little bit. Almost like Dr. Forbes Winslow. Oh no, I changed my mind about something. I now too am a Jack the Ripper suspect.
Yep. You turned the tables on me. You turned the tables in a wrong way. You got me mad now.
Old Leechy Juice here is pretty fucking suspicious when you really think about it. Like, what was he doing for 5 minutes? And maybe he did just play it off like he found her, but he actually did fucking kill her. Oh, and Modern Magic also said the reason that he gave the real address and real place of work but a fake name is probably because it would be easier to lie about giving a fake name than giving a fake place of work. And hey, it's a pretty good fucking point again. So thank you for your comment once again, I really appreciate it. Mordant Magic has earned the Mastorian's official Pap of Approval, and old Leechy Boy has earned himself the first S tier of the video. Well, alright, my throat is starting to die already, so I better move on.
Journey is usually the part that you remember anyways.
The next suspect, this is why my voice gets destroyed. I'm going to keep repeating lines. The next suspect is John Pizer, A.K.A. Leather Apron, A.K.A. our Z-grade DC villain. Now, according to the website Whitechapel Jack, who covers Pizer very, very nicely, John Pizer was arrested by Police Sergeant William Thick on September 10, 1888, after the murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman. Pizer was known around town as Leather Apron, and eventually, lots of locals thought Leather Apron was the Whitechapel killer, even though technically there was no evidence against him. He technically though would fit the bill because he was a Polish Jew, he worked as a bootmaker in Whitechapel, and he often threatened prostitutes by knife point.
Okay.
However, he was later cleared of suspicion when it was realized that he had alibis for 2 of the murders. He had been staying with family at the time of one of the canonical 5 murders, and was talking with a constable while witnessing a raging fire on the London docks at the time of another murder. Now, having known William Thick for years, John Pizer claimed that he had been detained as a result of Thick's animosity towards him, rather than any substantial evidence. Although he did have one prior conviction for actually fucking stabbing someone, there just isn't any concrete evidence that John Pizer was Jack the Ripper, and not to mention that he has alibis for at least 2 of the 5 murders. Therefore, John Pizer gets a D tier. Next up is William Henry Burry. Now this one starts out great, but then ends like a wet fart. Burry, or Berry, had been living in Bow or Bow, London during the time of the Ripper murders with his wife Ellen, a former prostitute. He and Ellen later moved to Dundee, Scotland, and then one night he killed her. This piece of shit strangled Ellen to death with a rope. Shortly afterwards, he inflicted several post-mortem abdominal wounds with a penknife. Then he stuffed her body into a trunk, which he'd kept hidden in their flat for 6 days. Then, on February 10th, 1889, Burry then went to the Dundee Central Police Station and told Lieutenant James Parr that his wife Ellen had forfeit the game. William Henry Burry, in his infinite wisdom, told Lieutenant James Parr that he woke up the next day after being drunk, only to find his wife on the floor with a rope around her neck. But instead of doing what a normal person would do, like look for a doctor, Barry told the lieutenant that he instead cut the body up and hid it in that trunk. Apparently, he was feeling guilty about it and expressed his fear that he may be arrested as Jack the Ripper. Now, after listening to this bullshit, after listening to this ridiculous confession, Lieutenant James Parr took Barry upstairs to see the head of the detective department, Lieutenant David Lamb, saying to David Lamb, quote, "This man has a wonderful story to tell you." Barry then proceeded to tell David Lamb the story, but this time he told it slightly differently. This time adding that he only stabbed Ellen once, and also dropped the part where he said he was worried about being arrested for being Jack the Ripper. Well, didn't matter, they immediately arrested him and charged him with Ellen's murder. When investigators went to check the flat out, they found shitloads of evidence. They found the rope he used to strangle her, they found strands of her hair between the fibers of the rope, they found the penknife that he used to cut her apart, they also found bloodstained clothing and some of Ellen's personal belongings burned in the fireplace. This flat was also devoid of furniture, suggesting that they either burned it as a means to heat the room or it was an attempt to destroy evidence. The interesting part about all of this is that they also found chalk graffiti containing Jack the Ripper references found on the back door of Barry's flat. There was also graffiti in the stairwell leading up from the back of the property. The marking on the door read, quote, "Jack Ripper is at the back of this door." And the one on the stairwell said Jack Ripper is in the cellar. Now, it was thought that a local boy may have been responsible for the graffiti, but the precise identity of the writer was never determined. Now, despite extreme suspicions by the media, despite the fact that he actually said to Lieutenant James Parr, "I'm worried about being arrested for being Jack the Ripper," and despite the suspicions of his hangman, Barry adamantly denied any connection between him and the Ripper murders. So this was all a big waste of time. But he was a piece of shit that killed his wife, and it seems that he strangled Ellen while he was pissed out of his mind and they were having an argument about money. And when he started feeling that her disappearance would be noticed, he concocted the story that she forfeit the game. The police did, however, look into him a little bit further as a possible Jack the Ripper suspect, but of course they found no substantial evidence and they discounted him completely. Bill Barry gets the D tier. Next up is A.A. Ron Kosminski.
Where are you? Where is A.A. Ron right now? No A.A. Ron, huh? Well, you better be sick, dead, or mute, A.A. Ron.
Here.
Oh, man. Why didn't you answer me the first time I said it, huh?
Because it's pronounced Aaron.
Son of a bitch! You done messed up, A.A. Ron!
Now, I covered A.A. Ron briefly in episode 4, the double event and debunking the Edo Shawl. But just because the shawl is most likely a bunch of bullshit, it doesn't mean that this guy is clear. This guy's name's become synonymous with the Jack the Ripper mystery, so maybe there's something to it. Let's find out. A.A. Ron Kosminski was a Polish hairdresser who immigrated from Congress, Poland to the East End of London in the 1880s. He worked in Whitechapel during the time of the murders, and then in 1891, he was institutionalized after he threatened his sister with a knife. Why does everybody seem to be threatening people with knives in this time period? Am I missing something? Was it normal? Anyway, he was first held at the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum and then transferred to the Leavesden Asylum. Now, why is he a suspect? Other than, of course, threatening his sister. Well, police officials from the time of the murders named one of their suspects as Kosminski, although the forename was not given, and they described him as a Polish Jew who was in an insane asylum. Furthermore, this actual guy, A.A. Ron Kosminski, was picked out of a lineup by a witness. Amazing! Now we are getting somewhere. I'm lying. There is a couple of small problems. Firstly, Robert Anderson, if you remember that fucking prick who just went to Switzerland while the Whitechapel murders were going on, never specified who picked who out of a lineup. So I'm not even sure if this whole somebody got picked out of a lineup story even happened, and if it did happen, if that person was actually A.A. Ron Kosminski. So what the fuck are we even doing here? I don't know. In 1910, Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson claimed in his memoirs The Lighter Side of My Official Life that he really loved Switzerland, and boy did he wish he was in London to help with that Jack the Ripper case. But he also somehow came to the conclusion, without being in London to investigate this case for himself, that the Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew. So clearly, he didn't have a fucking name. And isn't the first thing that you're gonna do when somebody gets picked out of a lineup, you go to them and ask them, "What's your name, buddy?"
I'm not your buddy, friend. He's not your friend, guy. I'm not your guy, buddy.
So where does the name Kosminski come from then? Well, that comes from Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who led the Ripper investigation and named the man as Kosminski. And he wrote this name down in the margin of his presentation in a copy of Anderson's memoirs. He added that Kosminski had been watched at his brother's home in Whitechapel by the police, and that he had been taken with his hands tied behind his back to the workhouse and then to Colney Hatch Asylum, and then he died shortly afterwards. Now here's the biggest problem. We know that A.A. Ron Kosminski did not die shortly afterwards. He died in 1919, longly afterwards. So who the fuck are they actually talking about? Now that is a good question. It's so good in fact that nobody knows the answer. But people have been trying to figure it out, and in 1987, a Ripper author named Martin Fido searched asylum records for any inmates called Kosminski, and he found only one. Aaron Kosminski. Yeah, I'm going to start saying his name properly now. At the time of the murders, Aaron apparently lived either on Providence Street or Greenfield Street, both of which are close to sites of the murders. However, the address of the Kosminski the police suspected was recorded as Mile End Old Town, just on the edge of Whitechapel. So that, plus the fact that Aaron didn't die until way later, might suggest that the police were in fact talking about someone else entirely. And many people believe that they were actually talking about David Cohen, A.K.A. Nathan Kaminski. Now, if you're not familiar with this suspect or theory, I'm going to cover it extremely briefly because it has been proven to be incorrect. To put it simply, some weirdo is found wandering the streets in December 1888, just a few months after the final Jack the Ripper murders. He's arrested for being a danger to himself and to others, and due to his inherent and incomprehensible muttering, he was registered at a workhouse under the name David Cohen. If that happened today, we would call them John Doe. It's essentially like a nameless name. Cohen then starts becoming increasingly violent, and people start thinking, hey, there's something wrong with this guy. And off to Colney Hatch Asylum he goes. And very much unlike Kosminski, he remained there until he died in 1889, 1 year after the Ripper murders ended. Now, some people have kind of put two and two together and come to the conclusion, I guess, using Workhouse and Colney Hatch Asylum records, to deduce that David Cohen's real name was actually Nathan Kaminski. Therefore, these sort of similar sounding names and physical descriptions could have confused Sir Robert Anderson. My personal opinion though is that Robert Anderson didn't give a fuck and spent most of this killing spree in Switzerland, so his opinion ain't worth a goat's fart in a hurricane. However, this possible misunderstanding has been proven incorrect, because an Aaron Davis Cohen was discovered in the magistrate's court records, whose arrest and imprisonment lines up with this David Cohen guy. Therefore, they couldn't have confused this guy's name with another name because that was actually his name, David Cohen, or Aaron Cohen. So most researchers are now of the opinion that this is not the guy the cops thought it was, and probably not Jack the Ripper. The biggest problem with both the Aaron Kosminski and David Cohen theory is that people base this off the names being written in the memoirs, meaning the police suspected this Kosminski person but then mixed up the actual people. But we gotta remember that the police suspected a lot of people. They suspected Montague John Druitt, George Chapman, Carl Feigenbaum, etc., etc. But if we look at actual statements made by the big cheese Robert Anderson himself, and Inspector Frederick Aberline, and even Sir Melville McNuggets, they very clearly had no idea who Jack the Ripper really was. So this name being in the memoirs means literally nothing. To prove a point that they don't really say any names or say anything definitive, this statement from the 1894 Sir Melville McFlurry Memoranda introduced Kosminski as one of three major suspects, stating that he was, quote, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. There were many circs connected with this man, which made him a strong suspect, end quote. So he didn't really say anything, and he didn't say he's the killer. Now, Big Cheese Robert Anderson's theory about a low-class Polish Jew appeared for the first time in an article in 1895, but was later repeated and slightly modified in his own book, The Lighter Side of My Official Life. And oh my god, he changed his mind. He was probably Jack the Ripper. He probably lied about going to Switzerland and it was him killing all of those women. See how easy it is to make up a bullshit theory. Anyways, he said, quote, "One did not need to be a Sherlock Holmes to discover that the criminal was a sexual maniac of a virulent type, that he was living in the immediate vicinity of the scenes of the murders, and the conclusion we came to was that he and his people were certain low-class Polish Jews. I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer and of the pressman who wrote the letter above referred to, but no public benefit would result from such a course." Why not, Robert? Why? 'Cause you don't fucking know. And the traditions of my old department would suffer. Why? From catching a criminal. I will merely add that the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him, but he refused to give evidence against him. End quote. Now this is the claim from Anderson regarding somebody picking someone out of a lineup. Based on the arguments I've seen online about who this could be, it seems clear that no one even knows who he's talking about, the witness or the suspect. However, people interpret it differently. Some people think the witness is Joseph Lawend, identifying Aaron Kosminski with Catherine Eddowes, for example. But as you can see from that quote, it is completely vague. But some people still take it a step further because they want to sell a book about how Aaron Kosminski is the Ripper, evidenced by a bloodstained shawl a policeman stole from a corpse to give his wife. But the fact of the matter is, Robert Anderson could have actually been talking about Israel Schwartz, witnessing the whole Lipsky thing with Elizabeth Stride. Nobody knows. So at the end of the day, this theory sucks, man. And it's going to get a brand new tier. It's going to get the W tier for what in the blue hell was that bullshit. Anyway, moving on. Next up is Triple H. Henry Webster Mudgett, better known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes. Now this good-for-nothing piece of trash was an American con artist and one of America's first serial killers. Since he was only active as a serial dickbag between 1891 and 1894, that means he had a bunch of free time before that to be the Whitechapel murderer as well. Or did he? Now I've come to learn recently that this asshole used to sell human skeletons to medical students. Skeletons that are now suspected of being his many victims. So some people think that H.H. Holmes was in London attempting to sell bones during 1888. Well, that's a great theory and all, the only problem is you gotta kinda prove that he was in London first, and as far as I can tell, there is no proof of that. But it is fun to speculate about Triple H being in London trying to buy human organs. Maybe he was the doctor that the medical students were talking about there. And if he is, he left 18 months before the murders began. And also, Triple H wasn't really trying to buy shit, he was trying to sell shit, so that he can build his murder mansion and all. Anyway, if you can prove that he was in London in that time, awesome, but it seems like he was actually in Chicago at that time. So I'll give old Triple H the old triple F tier. Next up is George Hutchinson, because he changed his testimony and his description of the killer a few times. So did literally everybody else. By that reasoning, Israel Schwartz is a top suspect. Caroline Maxwell is a top suspect. Elizabeth Foster is a top suspect. It's not enough. But some people think he's the killer because of that. Because he changed his story or he lied. Yet these same people say that Joseph Barnett is a ridiculous suspect. Yeah, man, I don't know. F tier. Next up is Lewis Carroll. Yes, that Lewis Carroll. The guy that wrote Alice in Wonderland. That guy. F tier. Next up is James Kelly.
No relation.
Now, James Kelly is another one of those guys that sounds really good until you get into the smaller details and realize that there's a couple of things that just don't really make sense. Now, Kelly was an English upholsterer who at some point in the early 1880s started to develop an increasingly unpredictable and explosive temper, which would eventually cause him to lose his job. But love overcomes all, and on June 4th, 1883, just a few days after losing his job, he would still marry his girlfriend. However, this marriage was a bigger disaster than the Netflix Death Note movie, because this guy would almost immediately accuse his wife of being unfaithful to him, and he believed that she gave him an STD. In actuality though, it probably came from the prostitutes of Whitechapel before he got married to her. Anyways, this whole thing got out of control very quickly, and then just 17 days after marrying her, he slashed his wife's throat with a knife. James Kelly was then very quickly arrested without resistance, and originally he was seen as fit for trial. You know, he was sane and everything. But then a guy named Dr. Orange, who was the superintendent of the Broadmoor Hospital, examined James Kelly and declared him insane. Dr. Orange apparently based this conclusion off of statements of James Kelly's former boss, Mr. Hiron, who told Dr. Orange that James Kelly had been acting weird. Now, they did spare him the death penalty, but in exchange, Kelly was sentenced to be confined in the lunatic asylum indefinitely. So then, after spending about 5 years in the asylum, James Kelly was actually regarded as a model inmate. But then, on January 23rd, 1888, he escaped from Broadmoor, using a key that he fabricated himself by modeling a piece of metal. It's pretty fucking cool. I love me a good prison break story. Now, this is where James Kelly becomes a Ripper suspect, because he escaped Broadmoor just before the Whitechapel murders began. Well, quite a while before they began. Like 6 months before they began, actually. If him escaping the facility before the murder spree began is relevant, then how do we rationalize the 6-month gap? What was he doing for those 6 months? Because we know this guy is capable of murder. So if people want to put this guy on the suspect list because he escaped just before the Whitechapel murders began, then you got to kind of explain the 6 months. And the thing is, I can explain it, and it eliminates him as a suspect, because it turns out that he first went to Liverpool and then he went to France to hide away from the coppers. So he wasn't in London.
Yeah. It seems you can kill people without having to be there in person.
Now, funnily enough, people also say that James Kelly is the American Jack the Ripper. Because like previously mentioned, in 1891, a prostitute named Carrie Brown was killed at the East River Hotel in New York, and it bore a big resemblance to the Whitechapel murders, and Kelly is known to have traveled to North America during these years. However, Kelly only went to North America in 1892, 1 year after Carrie Brown was already murdered.
Yeah.
So the Kelly suspect sucks ass and earns itself a nice big F tier. Next up is the Jill the Ripper theory. Another one that sounds good on paper, but yeah, we'll see. Now, the only female suspect at the time was a woman named Mary Pearcy, who was convicted of murdering her lover's wife. And some suspect her of being behind all of the Whitechapel killings as well, though the evidence is non-existent. However, it kinda makes you think though that perhaps all this time the coppers were looking for a dude, when they really should have been looking for a lady. According to Casebook, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes and believer in ghosts, believed that Twat the Ripper disguised himself as a woman in order to avoid capture and become more readily accessible to other women. Now, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is not the only person who had this idea. It was also suggested by Inspector Frederick Aberline. Apparently, he was talking to his mentor about Caroline Maxwell's sightings of Mary Jane Kelly after her presumed time of death. Caroline Maxwell testified to have seen Mary Jane Kelly not once, but twice, several hours after the doctors believed that she had been murdered. The first time she saw her was between 8 and 8:30 a.m. in front of Miller's Court, looking, in Maxwell's opinion, to be quite ill. Basically fucking hungover or something. Now, Maxwell was able to be sure of the time because her husband returned from work at 8 o'clock each morning. Then apparently Caroline saw her a second time a couple hours later, and Kelly was speaking with a man outside the Britannia public house. Maxwell was even able to vividly describe the clothes that this woman that she thought was Kelly was wearing. She said she was wearing a dark shirt, a velvet bodice, and a maroon colored shawl. When she was asked if she had ever seen Kelly in this outfit, she replied that she definitely remembered her wearing that shawl. So Frederick Aberline had no reason to think that Carola was talking shit, and she was pretty adamant on the times and descriptions that she had given. Although they ignored her, this witness sighting did perplex Aberline quite a lot, and he asked his mentor, quote, "Do you think it could be a case not of Jack the Ripper, but Jill the Ripper?" Aberline speculated that it was possible that the killer dressed up in Kelly's clothes in order to disguise himself, therefore accounting for Mrs. Maxwell's sighting of her the next day. His mentor, though, said, "Nah, bruv, you lost your fucking marbles." But he did proceed to indulge himself in some harmless speculation and told Aberline that he thought that if it were a woman committing the crimes, the only kind capable of doing so would be a midwife, and so the Jill the Ripper theory was born. Sometimes it's called the Mad Midwife. Now the theory asks 4 questions. What sort of person could move about the night without arousing suspicion of their own household or the other people that they might have met along the way? A policeman? No, a midwife. 2. Who could walk through the streets in bloodstained clothing without arousing too much comment? A policeman. Also probably a butcher? No, a midwife. 3. Who could have had the elementary knowledge and skill to have committed the mutilations? Anybody. Jack the Ripper didn't have any knowledge. And 4. Who could have been found by the body and yet given a satisfactory alibi for being there? Charles Lechmere. No, it's a midwife again. Because that's what midwives do. They rip women apart in dark alleys. All in all, the Jill the Ripper theory is a weird one. Because ideas like the killer had anatomical knowledge has been debunked. Ideas like the killer had blood on him has been debunked. If Jill the Ripper was just trying to perform abortions and failing, why is there evidence of strangulation on the victims? And it's the strangulation that causes the mutilations to be considerably less bloody. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to board the train for Crazy Town, so hold on to your butts. Some authors said that Joseph Barnett dropped hints that Mary Jane Kelly had definitive lesbian tendencies. As we know, Barnett was thrown out of Kelly's housing and replaced with Maria Harvey, the suspected lesbian lover of Mary Kelly. So it's it's speculated that perhaps the possibility of a vengeful female may have been Jack the Ripper. And well, explain the fucking guy in the backyard, the 40-year-old weird-looking foreign guy talking to Annie Chapman then. Because that sure as shit weren't no woman. And our final suspect, or theory I should say, is that Jack the Ripper didn't exist. The press created this elusive character by sensationalizing their extensive coverage of the case, emphasizing this mystery of an unseen killer, which naturally led to a lack of significant clues for the police. And this all caught the public by storm and captured their imaginations, transforming a series of random, unconnected murders into the legend of a single notorious serial killer known as Jack the Ripper. That said though, there is evidence that at least 3 of these women were killed by the same guy, and that's just based off of the autopsy and the mutilations. But I understand the idea. I can understand that these kills may have been committed by different people. So I don't know, I'll give that one a B tier. Oh, and Jill the Ripper. Where do we put Jill the Ripper? I like it. I'll give it an S tier. I don't believe it. I don't believe it at all. But I like it. It gets an S tier for some real sideways thinking. Anyway, that's all I have. I didn't feel like reading any more because as you heard, most of them were pretty bad. So this is it. I don't ever want to talk about Twat the Ripper ever again. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for sticking around and watching this very long video. And you may have noticed that there were some critters taped to my state-of-the-art TV. Those are the community critters. And if you're wondering how to get your buddies featured in a video, all you gotta do is post a picture of them on the community tab. And sooner or later, they'll pop up in one of the videos. I also want to personally thank everyone who's dropped a super thanks on the channel. I really appreciate your support. And of course, a big thank you to all of our incredible channel members. Now, channel members, we do have something very exciting for you. I'm gonna make a members post pretty soon to explain exactly what it is, and I'm pretty sure you're gonna love it. So just look out for that. And of course, I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who just watches the videos or interacts in some way, whether it be through commenting, likes, or dislikes. Even the people who put my channel in the F tier and said do not recommend this channel anymore. It's awesome, man. I'm glad that you guys are enjoying whatever the fuck it is I do here. But yeah, I appreciate all of you guys, and as always, leave your thoughts and theories in the comment section, like the video if you had a good time, subscribe for more, and I'll see you again soon with another mystery. Thanks for watching.